Well, welcome. If welcome. If you're, it's about 6 o'clock in New York and about 11 o'clock in London, and good morning if you're in Australia and a few other places here. You know the purpose. The purpose of this group is to gather a gang together, to gather that young gal. If you're a young gal, what's your budget? How much money do you have to spend? If you have a child, how can you afford to for a daycare center and still make ends meet? And how do you stay up all night and still get to work, and the definition of work and all that? And if you're a guy and you're trying to support a wife and children, how much money do you make and how many hours do you have to work? And then we're going to push you to go back to home economics. If you had a 1950s detached house in the United States and you were running a budget just like you were an American housewife, how much of a budget would you have in order to get into to make ends meet, to get the shop running, to run the household just like a business? How much is furniture? How much are groceries and clothes and piano lessons? And how much are tennis lessons for yourself? The American housewife had a working life, and once the kids started to get into school, that was her first chance to have recreation, and so it's for her to play tennis. And so you would have a professional woman, a professional household, home economist, and amateur tennis players, and that sort of thing. And if you're a guy and you're working, you have a job, a plumber is a job, a professional athlete isn't. A guy who makes his living getting into a duplex and renting property out to other people isn't just not making a living, he's a bad guy. And so if you're one of the good guys, you have a job that produces things. How many hours would you have to work in order to come up with that budget? If, excuse me, if you could put those two together, if you're a gal that says enough of this, all this talk about hitting poverty, or all this poverty that's been caused, and all the people living in despair, you can do something about it. You can say, okay, this is how much money I need to get the go back to home economics, to get people out of poverty and into plenty. And if you're a guy, how many hours do I have to work? And with those two numbers, you know where you want to go. You know where we are. You can do wondrous things that way. You can do a lot of good that way. So let me remind myself once again, what is home economics? Home economics is when the married couple is viewed as a basic economic building block. It's as opposed to individual rights and that sort of thing. So you go back to the household unit. Mommies can't, 10-year-olds can't pay for their mommies. Mommies can't take care of the child and go out and work in the factory. And so the husband and wife are viewed as a single unit. And they have a house to live in, and there's a living room to live in, and a dining room to eat in, and a kitchen to support the dining room, and a bedroom, and an American car, and a big American car in the garage. And it becomes a single unit. It's what gets people out of poverty and into plenty. They talk about poverty, they forget to ask what is not poverty, and that's that feeling of plenty. And then, as we said before, picture that house and go off to the side, and in a normal shop manual fashion, start with farming and mining, then above that, manufacturing, then above that, wholesale, retail, and repair, and then above that, retirement, education, and recreation. And doctors and lawyers form a kind of lattice that holds it all together. And it's the Catholic priest that causes it to come into being to begin with. It's a religious thing. It comes out of popes and monks and monasteries and that sort of thing. And it does. The requirement is that you have to be normal and well adjusted. But being normal and well adjusted just isn't a natural thing. And that really messes you up. Remember the classic battle of good and evil, the priest and the pimp. That's what this channel is named. The priest is on one side and says, say what you mean and mean what you say. And then you go in line, there's a flip-flop, go off to the other side, and there's a pimp. And the pimp knows how to hustle, con, manipulate, and intimidate people. And there's that flip-flop in the middle. And if you're a young gal or if you're a young guy, it's a bit earthy, but it's an old worldly Catholic thing. You close your eyes, you fantasize about the gals until you become sexually aroused. And then you separate the act of sex from the act of getting the gal pregnant, which is what human beings do anyway. And then you start to go out and look at people who hustle, and you realize that in a normal common sense fashion, they're a bunch of they're a bunch of queers, they're scoundrels. You realize it's their emotion. They have no love in them, and it's the normal taken into the abnormal. Then you go back the other way. You close your eyes, you fantasize about the gals until you become sexually aroused. And then this time you fantasize about actually getting the gal pregnant. It's just like a sack that's inside out and you put it right side in. And that act is not a natural thing at all. And there you have original sin with a snap of a finger. You have to be taught that. And you put it together with the other things, fear and violence. The environment changes your attitude changes your environment. You have to be taught that, and so it becomes a very famous phrase. What takes away your free will? Fear, sex, ignorance, and violence. In other words, you become a normal Joe and sit there and fantasize about sex and play sex inside of getting the gal pregnant, and don't be afraid, and straighten yourself up normally. You will the good of another person, and you do it because of that disposition that's in the priest in the movie The Exorcist. That disposition is what you call faith. You hold that as faith and take off again. You start to be normal. And so if you look back to the 1950s, you notice that they would make reference to the ideal woman and the ideal man. That's what they're talking about. You're not going to come close. You might bat 300 like a baseball batter at best, but you'll be amazed at all the good things that happen. And so if you're going to be a professional citizen, and if you're going to take on home economics as a profession, then you get to own the house, kiddo. There's no arguing this. You get to have the movies made about you, the songs sung about you. And there's a working life of a professional housewife. She gets, and there's this order of things. Once the kids are in school, she gets to play in that tennis tournament. And I guess if she's a movie star, she gets to be the host of the variety show. And there's a set of priorities, and that's the set of priorities. The very definition of the United States first goes through the mind of that person and then into the geography and out again. And the same is true of the guys. The Darwin alpha male is the sexiest kind of guy there is. And he has no love, no guilt in him. He attacks people smaller than him. And he might get into a duplex and start renting property out. And he's a very scummy guy, but he's also the sexiest guy around, like the chimpanzee side of us. And it worked. They did it. They pulled it off, and they won, and it worked. And the result is all this poverty. If you head in the other direction, and you're a married guy, and you're trying to come across, you're the one that's going to come across with bicycles for the kid at Christmas time, then, well, you get to be first in line at the courthouse to plead guilty to the paternity suit. It's not your, you'll never be as sexy as that real scummy guy. Well, that's life. And if you look at this world and look in the poetic to see if you can find something to make reference to, there's the sheriff of Dodge City. There's the American Army Green Berets who defend the poor and the oppressed for no good reason. There's the average Joe and all this heroic stuff. That's just life. And so what did they do? They had a revolution in this country. In the 1950s, the communists said they would have a revolution, and they would overthrow the United States using economics by about the year 1973. And there was a huge upheaval in our society in 1973. The same is true with England, same is true with Australia and a few other places. And that was when a major shift happened. We went from home economics to individual rights. It was simply theirs to either get onto a maintenance level or to choose to pig out, and they chose to pig out. They threw out God, they threw out that last end argument. They had the sexual revolution, they adopted malice, and they threw out decency as a formal argument. In other words, it was suddenly became okay to make money, even if it caused other people to live and to have to work more hours, causing poverty. And so if you're a young gal, or if you're a gal, you have a child, and you don't know how in the world things are going to, how you're going to make ends meet, you're not going to, it's not going to work out. It wasn't intended for you to work out. They didn't care about you. And so it's up to you. You're going to have to speak up. You're going to have to join this gang and say, okay, that's enough. This is what I need to get the shop going. Fork it over. The overwhelming majority in the 1950s that oppressed housewife, the overwhelming majority of the housewife did the overwhelming majority of consuming. And then there's the guy. You had to work more and more hours. If you had a job such as a plumber, you had to start working more and more hours. And now you're beside yourself. Chances are, if you're working as a plumber or you're working driving a forklift or something, you're going to have to rent property. And that's something we just didn't do here in the United States. That's the enemy who decided to be the upper class and own it all and rent it. That's why we had a revolution. Remember, we had a revolution with those kinds of British guys, not the other kind that invented everything. Excuse me. There are words for people like that. Peon is one of them. A peasant is one of them. And there's one that begins with the letter N. I'm not even allowed to say it. I don't know why. That's horrible. If you can't say it, then chances are you are one. And so that's as opposed to people living in the foothills, and they're collecting rent from you. You don't rent property to people. You don't rent property from people, with certain obvious exceptions and that sort of thing. You go the other way. The priest who takes a vow of poverty maximizes profits. You have the leadership style of washing the feet of the apostles. In other words, you make money by putting somebody else in their own business. This neighborhood is an example. This neighborhood that I live in. This is a house I grew up in. I still live here. And when it was first built in 1950s, when it was first built, one guy would build this house, another guy would build a house next door, another guy would build the house on the other side, and they in effect made houses for each other. Our dad was a repairman, next door was a plumber, two doors down was a milkman, if you remember what they are, and they built houses for ourselves as if you took your hand and pushed away. About a mile to your right, as you're watching this, was a lawyer's and doctor's house. It was a much nicer house, but it was the same thing. It was a house, only a little nicer. And the idea of buying apartments and renting it out, or putting people in communist housing projects, they're considered the enemy. And that all changed. You could see it here in this neighborhood. One guy, the university's down the street, and they started buying houses for their children to stay, and then when their child graduated, they'd sell the house, and the very act of that caused houses to skyrocket. And then they started buying a house and putting an apartment or two in the backyard and renting it out. And then they started doing things like building these huge houses that just happen to have 7 bedrooms, and they call them houses, and they're obviously apartments. And you could see the idea of a slum forming. It's how slums are built. And they themselves moved into the foothills and started collecting rent. And the other things that fall in with slums, the road turning into a major highway, they're putting a 100-foot power line down the middle of the road so they can bring power up to the foothills, a place where neither the Republicans or Democrats wanted houses to be built. This is Tucson. And it looks like the lazy V, the letter V going up like this. Every stereotypical thing that happened. including the attitude. Gone is any sense of love, gone is any sense of empathy. They have no guilt. They're not guilty of anything because they have no guilt in them. And it just goes on. So the idea is to get you to stand up and do something. If you could just start calling in and saying, enough is enough. I'm a gal. This is what I need. I have 2 kids, a teenager, or a couple of toddlers. This is a house. The mortgage is this. The house is such and such a size. The bedroom has to be about 10 by 12 feet in order to handle 2 kids of the same sex, if I got the stories right. And if I don't, well, you call it and correct it. And then you say, this is how much money I need to get everybody out of poverty and into plenty. And then if you're a guy, how many hours do I have to work? Once you get those 2 numbers, you can start to adjust things. Remember the proper role of in this camp, the courts, the Supreme Court would put curbs on the road. You can't be a communist, can't be a fascist. Because God exists, you have to be a normal, well-adjusted person, and then you have to have home economics. You have to make money by making somebody else better off. And then the goal of the public administrator would be similar to the Football and Baseball Commission. They regulate parameters of competition. If you're the home economics, you're the very definition of what the United States would be, America. And so if you're a public administrator, you don't worry about, you don't decide if they, what they're going to have or not have. You just put a Cadillac in the driveway. That's all you have to worry about. And things, look at what happened. There was this huge middle class. We lived in a world that was unlike any in the history of human beings on this earth. And they threw that out because under this auspices of bigotry. It was discrimination. Let's keep this, excuse me. Let's go a little bit farther. If you're a guy, the working life of a guy is from the time he graduates from high school, he's about 17, to the time he was 65, which used to be retirement age. He would work 40 hours a week, Monday through Friday, and get a couple of weeks off a year and some holidays. And that was his working life. And so you would think the idea would be to maybe lower the amount of hours so he might have a day for himself and a day to do chores and a day for the children, wife and kids. And that's and walking down that road. And instead it was just the opposite. I've heard an awful lot of speeches and an awful lot of lectures in my life. I've never once heard anybody say anything positive about working in a communist factory, even though communism is the prima donna intellectuals government. In the United States, very few gals, I'm sure, want to put their child in a daycare center and spend their life working in a factory just to make tennis rackets for the intellectuals. And very few guys want to work in a communist factory just so they can spend their lives making things for the class of intellectuals, for the people in the upper class. But when it came to factories in the United States, the famous example was the Ford plant. And one of the communist dictators came over to take a tour of the United States. I'm rather sure it was a Ford plant. And what he couldn't perceive was the size of the parking lots, how huge the parking lots were, and how many cars were in the parking lots. That's because in the United States, we had gone to war to get women and teenagers and old people out of the factories. And we had paid the factory workers, us, enough money to support a wife and children. And we were, in a very real way, building cars for ourselves. And that was what made the United States a magical place to live. And they threw that out. And we're paying the price for it. they're going to live and die and get away with it. And if there is a heaven and a hell, well, they're going to have something to answer for. And if there isn't, well, they won, and we live in poverty. If there's a heaven and hell, we still live in poverty anyway. And the people who were decent, the people who tried to practice virtues, were the people who fell into poverty. Notice they talk about the gal or people on food stamps and living in Section 8 housing, and they're supposed to be the people who are taking advantage of the United States. No, it's just the opposite. It's literally the opposite at this moment. There was a welded connection between money and malice, and they made money by cashing in on it all. They made money by being professional consumers. They would, the example of the husband and wife that got together, our example of the architect marrying the gal with a degree in counseling, and instead of being a yank, instead of being normal and well-adjusted, they decided to cash in on it all. They knew how to manipulate people. And so the husband at the time still made enough money to pay for the electric bill and gas bill. And so the gal's income was extra. And with that, instead of putting you in your own house, they bought a duplex for themselves and got somebody else to rent the duplex and pay for their mortgage. And who would rent the duplex? Well, there used to be a huge middle class, and the people at the bottom of that middle class fell out of middle class and into a class of peasantry. And they had to start renting. And there it is. There's the thin edge of a wedge that caused that started a peasant and property class society. And it just grows from there. And so you're just going to have to be a gal. You're just going to have to listen to this and speak up and say something. And if you're a guy, you're just going to have to say enough of this. You can't feel courage when you need courage, and you're just going to have to face this kind of violence, whatever words it's called, and chime in. If you're a gal, I hope we're going to go off the air now. We'll be back on the air tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, at 9 o'clock Los Angeles time and 12 o'clock New York time. And we hope you'll hear this and pass the word. If you can get enough gals together and say, that's enough, this is what we need. And enough guys together to say, okay, this is how many hours I have to work. Then you can do something. You can take that and do lots of good things with it. So I hope to see you tomorrow.